In 1969, this factory made 1 million toy cars a day. Today, it doesn't exist. Not closed, not abandoned. Erased, demolished to make way for flats on the fringe of the Olympic Park, beside a canal that doesn't remember what it carried. 3,600 workers once clocked in here. Women whose hands were fast enough to fit windows into die-cast frames smaller than a matchbox. Men who poured molten metal and turned it into tiny Jaguars and Rolls Royces that sold for the price of a bag of sweets. Their buses were painted blue and yellow. Their factory shook the ground. How does something that enormous, something producing 100 million models a year, selling on every continent, the most popular toy car the world had ever seen, simply vanish? Not slowly, not gracefully. In receivership by the summer of '82, the brand sold to foreign owners, the tooling shipped to Asia, and eventually the building itself pulled down to the last brick. This is what happened on the banks of the River Lee, and how a place that made childhood disappeared. There's a stretch of water in East London where the River Lee bends south toward the Thames, and if you walk it now, past the new flats, past the coffee shops with their reclaimed timber and exposed brick, you won't find what used to stand here. Not a plaque, not a wall, not a single rivet left in the ground. But something was here, something enormous. For the better part of 3 decades, these banks held one of the most remarkable factories Britain ever built. Not remarkable for what it made, though what it made was, in its way, extraordinary. Remarkable for the sheer stubborn audacity of the enterprise. A factory that took molten metal, zinc and aluminium alloys heated to liquid brightness and turned them into tiny, perfect cars. Millions of them. Then millions more. By the late 1960s, this Riverside Works was producing 1 million units a day, 5 million a week, sealed in little boxes designed to look like matchboxes and sold for the price of a bag of sweets. The name was Lesney. The brand was Matchbox. And the people who made them, over 3,600 at the Hackney Wick works alone, were ordinary East Londoners. Women whose hands were quick enough for the fiddly assembly that no machine could do economically. Men who'd learned tool making or die casting or paint line work and built lives around the rhythm of the shifts. Families who relied on the blue and yellow buses that Lesney ran to bring workers to the gates and children to school. They made the world's most popular toy car. They sold it on every continent. And then, in the summer of 1982, receivers arrived at the door. The factory is gone now, demolished in early 2010, cleared to make way for housing on the fringe of the Olympic Park. If you stand on the right stretch of the River Lee navigation today, you're standing where the loading bays were, where forklift trucks moved pallets of finished Matchbox cars toward lorries and canal boats, and eventually the shelves of corner shops from Stepney to Sydney. What remains is the water. The river doesn't care what stood beside it. It carried barges when Hackney Wick was marshland. It carried them when the factories came. It carries narrowboats now, painted in cheerful colours, drifting past flats where the die-casting machines used to roar. This is the story of what happened here. How a handful of men who'd survived the war built something astonishing from almost nothing. How they mastered a kind of manufacturing that turned tiny margins into a global empire. How it all worked, brilliantly, relentlessly, for years. And how the world changed around them until the thing they'd built couldn't survive, no matter how many millions it sold. It's a story about what Britain could make, and what Britain lost. It begins, as so many post-war stories do, with men coming home. The Second World War ended and London was full of them. Demobilised servicemen with practical skills and not much else. They knew metal, they knew machinery, they knew how to improvise under pressure because that's what the war had demanded. What they didn't always know was what to do next, in a city still clearing bomb rubble and rationing bread. Lesney Products was born into that uncertainty. The company's origin sits in the landscape of small London workshops that sprang up in the late 1940s. Backroom operations, rented premises, die-casting work taken wherever it could be found. The founders came from that world of practical resourcefulness. Men who understood that a die-casting press could make industrial components one month and something else entirely the next, depending on where the orders came from. The early years weren't glamorous. This wasn't a company founded on a grand vision of toy empires. It was founded on the ability to cast metal parts, for industry, for whoever was buying. Toys entered the picture not as a calling, but as an opportunity. The way opportunities present themselves to people who are watching the market with hungry eyes and empty order books. Post-war Britain had children, and children wanted things to play with, and the materials and skills needed to make die-cast toys overlapped almost perfectly with the materials and skills these men already possessed. What happened next has become part legend, part marketing, and part genuine design insight. And the documentary record doesn't always separate the three cleanly. The story of the Matchbox is famous. Small die-cast vehicles, packaged in boxes styled to resemble matchboxes, sized to fit in a child's pocket or a parent's palm. Whether the packaging came first or the scale came first, whether it was a flash of inspiration or an incremental evolution, what matters is the result. Lesney had landed on something that worked. A toy car small enough to be cheap, detailed enough to be desirable, and packaged in a way that made it immediately recognisable on any shop counter in the country. But before Matchbox became Matchbox, before the little boxes with the dark blue and yellow livery became a fixture of British childhood, there was a proof of concept, and it came not from the toy aisle, but from the mall. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 sent the whole country into a frenzy of commemoration, and Lesney saw an opening. They produced a miniature coronation coach, a die-cast replica, gold-painted, ornate, in a way that must have seemed impossibly detailed for a mass-produced object. It sold. It sold enormously. Contemporary accounts describe sales exceeding 1 million units, a number that validated everything the founders suspected about the market for affordable, well-made miniatures. That coach didn't just pay the bills, it funded expansion. It proved that ordinary families would spend pocket money on a small, beautiful object if the price was right and the quality was there. The coronation coach was the spark. What followed was the architecture. Lesney didn't just make more toys, they built a system. The 1 to 75 range, a bounded universe of 75 models, refreshed and rotated, but always held to that number, was structural genius disguised as a product catalogue. It created collectability without requiring wealth. A child could own the whole set, theoretically, because the set had edges. It wasn't infinite. It was a world you could complete. And within that world, the range was democratic in a way that mattered. British commercial vehicles shared shelf space with American sedans, European sports cars, emergency vehicles, racing machines. A kid in Hackney could hold a Rolls Royce Silver Cloud in one hand and a cement mixer in the other, and both cost the same. That equality of price was the quiet revolution. We'll come to what it meant, what it felt like to buy one of these cars for pennies at a newsagent's counter. But first, the company had to build the machine that could make them, and for that, they needed Hackney Wick. The move to the riverside changed everything. Lesney's growth through the 1950s was the growth of a company finding its stride. More models, more sales, a workforce expanding to meet demand that kept arriving faster than anyone had planned for. But it was the Hackney Wick factory, beside the River Lee navigation on Lee Conservancy Road, that turned Lesney from a successful small manufacturer into something else entirely. Something closer to a phenomenon. The site mattered. Not for glamour. Hackney Wick in the mid-20th century was working London, plain and functional, a neighbourhood of small factories and terrace streets threaded through by waterways and railway lines. It mattered because the river was transport, because the road connections worked, because the available floor space was large enough to house the kind of operation Lesney's ambitions demanded. And because East London, in those years, had exactly the workforce a company like this needed. Skilled and semi-skilled people, many of them women, living close enough to walk or ride a bus to the gates. The factory that rose on that riverside parcel became, over the next decade, one of the most extraordinary manufacturing operations in Britain. Not because it was beautiful, it was a mid-century industrial building, functional as a wrench, but because of what happened inside it. To understand Lesney at its height, you have to understand that making a Matchbox car was not a simple thing. The finished product, a palm-sized vehicle weighing almost nothing, selling for pennies, was the end point of a manufacturing process as layered and precise as anything in British industry. Each model began in a design office, where the decision about which vehicle to produce next was made in meetings that balanced market appeal, manufacturing feasibility, and the strange alchemy of what a child might want to hold. From that decision flowed a sequence of craft and engineering that moved through the factory like a river finding its channel. First, the drawing office translated the chosen vehicle into technical plans. Then the pattern shop, staffed by craftsmen whose skill was irreplaceable, carved large wooden masters, scaled-up versions of the final product from which the production moulds would be derived. Those masters had to be perfect. Every curve, every panel line, every wheel arch had to be right at large scale, because the moulds made from them would reproduce every detail and every flaw millions of times over. The tool room was where the masters became machines. Over 100 skilled toolmakers, and that number comes from Lesney's own contemporary account of its operations, worked in chrome vanadium steel, cutting the moulds that would shape molten metal into tiny car bodies, chassis, wheels, and accessories. A single model might require multiple moulds, each one engineered to withstand the pressure and heat of high-speed die casting, each one expected to produce hundreds of thousands of identical parts before it wore out and needed replacing. And then the casting floor. Picture it. More than 150 automatic die casting machines designed and installed by Lesney's own engineers. Not bought off a shelf, but purpose-built for this work. Rows of them, each one cycling through the same motion. Molten zinc alloy injected under pressure into a steel mould, held for a fraction of a second while it solidified, then ejected as a tiny, hot, gleaming component. Multiply that cycle by every machine on the floor. Multiply it by every hour of every shift. The numbers become almost abstract, but the physicality of it was anything but. The heat, the noise, the smell of hot metal and machine oil, the vibration that came up through the soles of your shoes and settled in your teeth. This was where Lesney's advantage lived. Not in any single innovation, but in the accumulation of engineering intelligence applied to every stage of the process. They didn't just cast parts, they painted them. Nearly 2,000 gallons of lead-free paint consumed every week in the spray shop, colours matched to real vehicles with a precision that collectors would later obsess over. They didn't just paint them, they stove-enamelled them. Over 2.5 million parts baked daily in industrial ovens until the finish hardened to a gloss that could survive years of a child's grip. They didn't just assemble them, they ran 20 assembly lines simultaneously, multiple models flowing side by side, each line a choreography of human hands, fitting tiny axles, pressing wheels, snapping bodies onto chassis. And at the end of it all, the packing machines, sealing more than 120 items a minute. Conveyor systems routing finished boxes via electronic selection, an early form of automated logistics that sorted models by type and destination and sent them onward to the loading bays, where they began the journey to shops, distributors, and export markets that stretched around the world. The numbers were staggering, but numbers on a page don't convey what this felt like as a living, functioning place. The factory wasn't a statistic. It was a community of over 3,600 people, all of them performing interlocking tasks in a rhythm so practiced it must have seemed, to anyone watching, almost effortless. It wasn't effortless. It was the product of years of refinement, of engineers solving problems most people would never know existed, of workers developing the hand speed and eye for quality that no machine could replicate. By the mid-1960s, Lesney's Hackney Wick operation was producing over 100 million models a year. Hackney's largest employer. A factory beside a London canal turning out more toy cars than most people could conceive of, and selling every last one of them. The General Motors of the toy world. Except General Motors never had to do it at pennies a unit. The machines are easy to admire. The engineering, the throughput, the sheer velocity of production. These are the facts that make Lesney look like a marvel of British efficiency. And it was. But a factory isn't machines. A factory is people. And the people who made Matchbox cars deserve more than a footnote in a story about die-casting tolerances. Start with the women. Contemporary accounts are plain about this. Lesney's Hackney factories were filled with women. Not as an afterthought, not as temporary wartime labour carried over past its supposed expiry date, but as the essential workforce for operations that demanded exactly what their hands could do. The assembly work, fitting windows into tiny frames, pressing wheels onto axles no thicker than a matchstick, aligning decals on surfaces smaller than a thumbnail, was, in the language of the time, tricky. Too tricky and too delicate to mechanise economically. The machines could cast and paint and pack. But the moment a Matchbox car needed a human touch, literally, the touch of fingers precise enough to fit parts measured in fractions of an inch, it was women's work. That phrase carried no prestige in the 1960s. It meant lower wages, usually. It meant work that was classified as unskilled or semi-skilled, regardless of the dexterity it demanded. It meant that the people most responsible for turning a collection of die-cast components into a finished toy car, the thing a child would actually hold, were the least likely to appear in the company's public story of itself. The brochures talked about toolmakers and engineers. The assembly lines ran on women's hands. They came from the streets around the factory, Hackney, Homerton, the estates and terraces of the Lee Valley. Many of them were mothers, and here is where the blue and yellow buses enter the story. Not as a charming detail, but as infrastructure that made the whole operation possible. Lesney bought redundant London transport buses, repainted them in the company's own blue and yellow livery, and ran them as a private transport service. They brought workers to shifts. They supported the school run. They turned the journey between home and factory into something managed, reliable, communal. If you lived in the right part of East London in the 1960s and your mother worked at Lesney, those buses were as familiar as the red double-deckers on the main roads. More familiar, perhaps, because they belonged to a specific world. Your world, the one bounded by the factory gates and the streets around them. The buses solved a practical problem: how to attract and retain a large female workforce in an era when childcare was the workers' problem, not the employers'. But they also did something less tangible. They made the factory visible. A fleet of bright blue and yellow buses moving through Hackney streets every morning and evening was a rolling advertisement. Not for Matchbox cars, but for the fact that this place was here, that it was big, that it employed your neighbours and your sisters and your mums. The factory's presence bled into the neighbourhood through those buses. It was impossible to live near Lesney and not know what happened inside those walls. And what happened inside those walls was, for the people who worked there, a life. Not a romantic life. Factory work is hard. The hours were long, the pace relentless, the environment loud and hot and full of chemical smells, paint solvents, machine lubricant, the particular sharp scent of freshly cast metal cooling in open air. Break times were short. The canteen served tea and whatever was going. The toilets were functional. Nobody was under any illusion that they were working in paradise. But it was steady. It was local. It paid a wage that, if never generous, was reliable. A weekly packet you could build a household around. And it carried something that's harder to quantify but impossible to overstate. The knowledge that the thing you were making mattered. Not in the way that bridges matter or medicines, but in the way that joy matters. Every Matchbox car that left Hackney Wick was destined for a child's hand. Every one of them would be raced across a kitchen floor, lined up on a windowsill, carried in a pocket to school, argued over in a playground, treasured in a biscuit tin. The women who assembled those cars, and the men who cast them and painted them and packed them, were making childhood. That's not nothing. The pride was quiet, in the way that working pride usually is. People didn't give speeches about it. But you could see it in the way former workers talked about the place years later. The way they said Lesney or Matchbox, with a particular inflection. Not reverence exactly, but ownership. We made those. That was ours. Outside the gates, the factory shaped the neighbourhood the way any large employer shapes the streets around it. The shops that served the workers, the pubs where shifts ended. The school runs time to the factory clock. The density of family connection. Sisters on the same line, husbands in the tool room, children who grew up knowing that the big building by the river was where the wages came from. Hackney Wick in those years was not a place that existed independently of Lesney. The two were woven together. Employer and neighbourhood, factory and community, the rhythm of production and the rhythm of daily life flowing in parallel, like the river beside the works. Now, step outside the factory. Leave the machines and the assembly lines and the buses and walk into a corner shop. Any corner shop, anywhere in Britain, in the mid-1960s. Behind the counter, beside the cigarettes and the boiled sweets, there's a small cardboard display. Matchbox cars. A few dozen of them standing in their boxes like soldiers in a parade. Each one priced at what a child could afford, or what a parent could justify on impulse. This is where Lesney's genius completed itself. Not in the factory, but in the transaction. The purchase. A Matchbox car cost pennies. That was the point. That was the entire commercial architecture of the 1 to 75 range reduced to its simplest expression. Make them cheap enough that buying one wasn't a decision. It was an impulse. A parent at the counter paying for a newspaper or a packet of cigarettes, and the child's hand reaching toward that display, and the cost so slight that saying yes was easier than saying no. Impulse shopping, as later observers would describe it, though no one standing at that counter would have used the phrase. What the child got for those pennies was something more significant than the price suggested. A Matchbox car wasn't a crude lump of metal stamped into a vaguely car-shaped form. It was, within the constraints of its scale, a serious attempt at replication. Doors that opened, suspension that worked. Windows, real plastic glazing fitted into the body. Paint that matched the real vehicle's colour, applied with the care of a model maker, baked to a finish that gleamed. A Rolls Royce silver shadow in miniature, accurate enough that a car enthusiast could identify the model year. A London bus with the right livery. A cement mixer with a drum that turned. For a working-class child, and Matchbox's audience was overwhelmingly working class because the price point made it so, this was a quiet form of access. The real Rolls Royce would never park outside your terraced house. The real Jaguar E-Type would never idle at the end of your street. But here in your palm was something that captured the essence of those machines, the shape, the colour, the proportions, the sense of engineered beauty made solid and holdable. You couldn't drive a Rolls Royce, but you could own one. You could own 75 of them, if you were patient and your pocket money held out. The 1 to 75 range was, in this light, a kind of social leveller, though Lesney never marketed it that way. Nobody at Lee Conservancy Road was writing manifestos about democratic access to automotive aspiration. They were making toys. But the effect was real. A child in Hackney could hold the same Matchbox Mercedes-Benz as a child in Mayfair, because the object cost the same to both of them. Almost nothing. The difference between those children's lives was vast and structural, and not to be minimised by a toy. But the toy itself didn't care about the difference. It was the same car in both hands. And the range was a world. That mattered too. The 1 to 75 lineup, as shown in the 1966 collector's catalogue, was a curated cross-section of the automotive universe. British lorries and coaches, American muscle cars and station wagons, European grand tourers, Mercedes, Ferrari, the aristocracy of the autobahn, military vehicles, farm equipment, emergency services, construction plant. It was a miniature civilization on a toy shop shelf, every aspect of vehicular life represented in palm-sized die-cast metal. Every piece produced in the same factory, by the same hands, to the same standard. Collectors would later treat these catalogues as sacred texts, and there's something touching about that. Grown adults poring over the exact shade of green on a number 47 ice cream van, debating wheel variations and baseplate markings, with the intensity of philatelists examining watermarks. But the catalogue's original audience was children, and for children the appeal wasn't academic. It was imaginative. You didn't collect Matchbox cars the way you collected stamps. You played with them, you built worlds, you raced them, you crashed them, you lined them up on the carpet and invented stories. The 1 to 75 range wasn't a collection to be preserved. It was a toolkit for imagination, priced so that almost anyone could afford to start building. That was the miracle Lesney had pulled off. Not just manufacturing at scale, though the scale was extraordinary, but manufacturing meaning at scale. 1 million tiny cars a day, each one carrying the same promise. You can hold something beautiful for almost nothing. You can own a piece of the world that's usually beyond your reach. And for years, it worked. The cars flowed out of Hackney Wick and into the world, North America, Europe, Australia, Japan, South America, by the 100 million. The factory hummed. The buses ran. The women's hands moved. The packing machines sealed their 120 boxes a minute, and still it wasn't enough, and still the orders came. By 1969, Lesney products had reached a height that would have been unimaginable to the men who started casting metal in a rented London workshop 2 decades earlier. 1 million units a day. Say it slowly, because the number deserves to be felt, not just heard. 1 million die-cast cars every working day flowing off the assembly lines at Hackney Wick. 5 million a week, over 100 million a year. Each one designed in the drawing office, cast from molten alloy, painted in matched colours, assembled by hand, sealed in its distinctive box, sorted by electronic conveyors, and dispatched to a distribution network that reached dozens of countries. Each one sold for pennies. Each one profitable, barely, thinly, on margins that depended on volume the way a river depends on rain. The workforce at the Hackney plant stood at around 3,600. The wider operation was larger still. Lesney was, by any measure, Hackney's dominant employer, the single largest source of wages in the borough, the institution around which thousands of East London families organised their lives. The blue and yellow buses were a fleet now, not a novelty. The factory's presence was the neighbourhood's heartbeat, and the product's reputation had achieved something rare. It was trusted across class lines and national borders simultaneously. Matchbox meant quality. It meant detail. It meant a toy you could buy your child without thinking twice about the cost. Confident that it would survive the kind of treatment children inflict on their possessions. Dropped, thrown, chewed, buried in gardens, left in the rain. And still look like a proper car at the end of it. The strong National Museum of Play, chronicling the brand's cultural significance, would later emphasise this pairing of high-quality, impressive detail and affordable prices as the foundation of Matchbox's global identity. In the late 1960s, that identity seemed unassailable. Lesney was the world leader in die-cast miniature vehicles. The 1 to 75 range was the standard against which competitors measured themselves. The factory was running at a capacity that represented, in effect, the outer limit of what a single British manufacturing operation could achieve in this category. Every machine turning, every line running, every shift filled. This was the peak, the absolute summit. And here's what nobody inside those walls could know. The summit was also the edge. The very things that had built Lesney's dominance, British manufacturing, British labour costs, British engineering pride, the conviction that realism and quality would always win, were about to collide with forces that didn't care about any of it. A flashy American competitor was about to change what children wanted from a toy car. A set of macroeconomic decisions made in Whitehall and the Bank of England was about to make British exports cripplingly expensive, and the tiny margins that sustained 1 million cars a day were about to prove not a strength but a fatal vulnerability. A high-wire act with no net, performed over a drop that went all the way down. But that's ahead of us. In 1969, the machines were still running. The paint shop was still burning through its 2,000 gallons a week. The women's hands were still fitting windows and wheels at a speed that no engineer could replicate mechanically. The packing lines were still sealing their 120 boxes a minute. The buses were still running. The river was still there. And on the shop counters of Britain and beyond, the little boxes kept disappearing into children's pockets, one after another, 1 million times a day. Pennies accumulating into an empire that seemed, in that moment, as solid as the metal it was built from. It wasn't. But they didn't know that yet. In 1968, a package arrived from California. Not literally, not a single parcel on a single desk. But the effect was the same. Mattel, the American toy giant, launched Hot Wheels. And nothing in the die-cast miniature world would be the same again. To understand what Hot Wheels did to Matchbox, you have to understand what Matchbox was. Not just as a product, but as an idea. Matchbox cars were replicas, faithful, careful, miniature reproductions of real vehicles, painted in colours that matched their full-sized counterparts, scaled to fit in a child's hand and a parent's budget. The appeal was realism. The pleasure was recognition. You looked at a Matchbox car and you saw the real thing, shrunken and solidified, and made yours. Hot Wheels didn't care about any of that. Hot Wheels cared about speed, about flash, about the kind of low-slung, wide-wheeled, metallic painted fantasy that looked less like something you'd see on a motorway, and more like something you'd dream about after watching a drag race on television. The colours were louder, spectraflame finishes that caught the light like boiled sweets. The wheels were different, low-friction axles on thin, fast-spinning wheels, designed not to sit on a shelf, but to move, to race down bright orange plastic tracks that Mattel sold alongside the cars, turning a static collection into a kinetic game. The effect on the market was immediate and brutal. Children, American children first, then children everywhere, looked at the two options on the shop counter and made a choice that had nothing to do with engineering fidelity or paint accuracy. They chose the one that was more exciting. They chose the one that moved. Contemporary accounts are blunt about the shift. Kids traded in the British product for these flashier American muscle cars, and the trade happened fast. This wasn't villainy. Mattel didn't destroy Matchbox through malice. They changed the rules of the game. For 20 years, Lesney had competed on realism, quality, and price, and won, decisively, worldwide. Now a competitor had arrived who competed on a different axis entirely. Spectacle, play value, the sheer visceral thrill of watching a tiny car scream down a plastic ramp. It was as if Lesney had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of the portrait, and someone had walked in with a cinema screen. Lesney's response was the superfast range, a retooling of the Matchbox line to incorporate low-friction wheels and faster axles, an attempt to match Hot Wheels' speed without abandoning Matchbox's identity. The engineering was sound, the execution was competent, but the cost was significant. New moulds, new wheels, new packaging, new marketing. Every pound spent on superfast was a pound diverted from the steady, profitable rhythm that had sustained the company for years. And the deeper problem wasn't mechanical, it was existential. What was Matchbox now? Was it the realistic miniature that parents trusted and collectors revered? Or was it the fast, flashy racer that children demanded? Could it be both? The superfast line tried to split the difference, keep the realistic body shapes, add the speed. But splitting the difference is what companies do when they can't decide who they are. And a company that can't decide who it is has already started losing. The advertising posture changed too. Lesney, which had built its empire on the quiet persuasion of a countertop display, The product, speaking for itself, priced to sell on impulse, now found itself in an arms race of television commercials and promotional campaigns, competing against Mattel's vastly larger marketing budget. American toy companies spent money on advertising the way American car companies spent money on chrome, lavishly, confidently, as a core part of the product experience. Lesney was a British manufacturer. Lavish spending was not in its vocabulary. None of this killed the company. Not yet. The superfast range sold. Matchbox remained a powerful global brand. But the ground had shifted. The certainty of the mid-60s that Matchbox owned this market and would own it indefinitely was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar to a company built on engineering confidence: doubt. The need to react rather than lead. The sense that the world was moving and that keeping up might cost more than standing still. And the costs were about to get much worse. What happened to Lesney in the years between Hot Wheels and the Receivers wasn't a single blow. It was an accumulation of pressures, each one survivable on its own, collectively fatal. Start with what the company was: a high-volume, low-margin manufacturer. Every Matchbox car sold for pennies. The profit on each unit was measured in fractions of a penny. The entire business model depended on selling colossal quantities, millions upon millions, and it depended on the cost of making each one staying low enough that those fractional margins remained positive. It was, if you step back and looked at it coldly, a business balanced on a razor's edge. Magnificent when it worked. Catastrophic when the numbers moved even slightly against you. And the numbers moved. The British economy of the late 1970s was not kind to manufacturers. Inflation eroded margins. Raw material costs climbed. Energy prices driven by the oil shocks of the decade made every heated process, and die casting is, fundamentally, a heated process, molten metal forced into moulds, more expensive. Wage pressures grew. The cost of keeping 3,600 people on a factory floor in East London, with all the associated overheads of transport and maintenance and compliance, rose steadily in an economy where prices rose faster than productivity. But the killing blow came from further away than Hackney. It came from Whitehall and Threadneedle Street. In 1979, the newly elected government and the Bank of England embarked on a monetary policy designed to crush inflation. Interest rates were driven to post-war highs. The Bank of England's minimum lending rate reached 17% in November 1979. 17% for a manufacturing company carrying debt, investing in new tooling, financing stock, and managing the cash flow gaps inherent in a business that made products months before they were paid for. That interest rate was not an abstraction. It was a hand around the throat. But the interest rates did something else, something that hurt Lesney in a way that was harder to see from inside the factory, but no less lethal. High rates attracted international capital to sterling, pushing the pound sharply upward against other currencies. And alongside the interest rate effect, North Sea oil revenues were flowing into the British economy, further strengthening the currency. Parliamentary research would later summarise it plainly. The combination created significant challenges for the competitiveness of the manufacturing sector, making UK products more expensive for foreign consumers, while simultaneously making imports cheaper. For Lesney, this was devastating. Matchbox was a global brand. Its survival depended on export markets. North America, Europe, Australasia, everywhere those little boxes had found their way onto shop counters. A stronger pound meant that every Matchbox car, priced in sterling at the factory gate, cost more to a buyer paying in dollars or Deutschmarks or yen. The margins that were already thin became thinner. The margins that were thin became negative. A product that had conquered the world on the strength of its value, extraordinary quality for pennies, was suddenly overpriced. Not because the quality had dropped or the price at the factory had risen unreasonably, but because the currency had moved. And in the arithmetic of international trade, currency is destiny. Contemporary reporting from Hackney lays out the immediate causes without euphemism. Cheap imports flooding the domestic market, high interest rates strangling cash flow, and the adverse rate of exchange making Matchbox so overpriced abroad that export sales, the lifeblood of the operation, were hemorrhaging. Add to this the structural shift in British retail. The old network of independent toy shops and corner newsagents, where Matchbox had thrived as an impulse purchase, was giving way to chain stores and supermarket toy aisles, where buying power was concentrated and discounts were expected. The chain stores didn't care about a supplier's heritage. They cared about price. And Lesney's prices, inflated by forces entirely beyond its control, were no longer competitive. The company had also, in its years of plenty, made decisions that looked reasonable at the time, but left it exposed when the climate changed. Acquisitions abroad. Diversification into product lines beyond the core die-cast range. Investments that spread resources without building the resilience the company would need when the storm arrived. Local reporting would later note insufficient investment in future products during the profitable years. Money spent on expansion rather than on the next generation of designs and tooling that might have kept the range fresh against competitors who were spending furiously. None of these factors alone would have killed Lesney. Together, they were a siege. The company was fighting on every front simultaneously, against a competitor with deeper pockets and a more aggressive marketing machine, against a domestic cost base that rose faster than revenue, against an exchange rate that punished every export sale, against interest rates that made borrowing to survive almost as dangerous as not borrowing at all, and against a retail landscape that was dismantling the very distribution model, the corner shop counter, the impulse purchase, on which the brand had been built. By the late 1970s, Lesney's financial trajectory had reversed with a speed that must have felt, inside those walls, like a betrayal. A pre-tax profit of £10 million in 1977 became a pre-tax loss of £10 million by 1981. £20 million of swing in 4 years. In a business built on pennies, that was an avalanche. The word they used was rationalization. It's a clean word, a word from boardrooms and consultancy reports. It means making things rational, efficient, logical, properly ordered. It doesn't sound like what it felt like on the factory floor. In February 1980, Lesney's management told the workforce what was coming. The company, one of Hackney's largest private employers, with until recently around 4,000 people across its Lee Valley and Hackney Wick operations, announced that over 2,000 workers had to go. The Rationalization program, they called it. The word hung in the air like smoke. The speed was the cruelty. Not cruelty by intent, perhaps. Management was trying to cut fast enough to save what remained, but cruelty in effect. Workers who had clocked in for years, who had built lives around the rhythm of the shifts, were gone. Some were already clearing out, waiting to collect final payments. The buses that had carried them to the gates carried them away again, and the gates felt different now, wider somehow, less certain, as if the building itself wasn't sure what it was for anymore. Union pressure reduced the number. The original figure, over 2,000, was negotiated down to 1,275. That's a victory in the grim arithmetic of redundancy. Nearly 800 jobs saved, at least for now. But 1,275 people still walked out of Lesney's factories and didn't come back. 1,275 wage packets that stopped arriving on Friday. 1,275 households in East London rearranging themselves around an absence. 10 of 13 UK production plants closed. The worldwide workforce was cut from over 9,200 to 5,700. Management pointed to the numbers that justified the pain. A claimed 42% rise in sales per employee after reorganisation. The factory was leaner, more efficient, more rational, and more frightened. The people who remained knew what the people who'd left had learned. That the ground beneath them was no longer solid. The certainty that had defined Lesney, the sense of a company so large and so successful that it would always be there, had cracked. You could feel it in the way people talked, in the way shifts felt different, in the quiet calculations workers made about how long this could last and what they'd do if it didn't. The labour regime that followed the Rationalization tells its own story. Over 600 people were hired on short-term contracts, a flexible workforce, in management language. In practice, it meant workers who could be let go with as little as 1 hour's notice during their first month. An hour. 60 minutes between having a job and not having one. The hourly rate was roughly £1.10, translating to a weekly wage of around £52. These were not the conditions of a company that felt confident about its future. These were the conditions of a company buying time. And still, the machines ran. Fewer of them, in fewer plants, with fewer hands. But the die-casting presses still cycled. The paint still flowed. The assembly lines, reduced now, concentrated, still turned components into tiny cars. Matchbox was still a global brand. The product was still selling. The name still meant something on shop counters from London to Los Angeles. This is the part that's hardest to hold in your mind. The dying and the living happened at the same time. Sales were, by some accounts, doing very well. The cars were moving. The brand retained its pull. But underneath the sales figures, the financial architecture was collapsing. Debt, interest payments, exchange rate losses, the accumulated weight of years of crisis management eroding whatever reserves of cash and confidence the company still possessed. It's like watching someone run a race with a broken leg. The fact that they're still running is extraordinary. The fact that they can't keep running is inevitable. The receivers came in the summer of 1982. Not with a bang. Not with a dramatic announcement from the factory steps. With the quiet, procedural finality of men in suits arriving with paperwork. Local reporting from Hackney described the moment with the plainness it deserved. Lesney had called in the receivers after more than 2 years of what the paper called a cliff-hanging battle for survival. More than 2 years. That phrase carries weight. 24 months of uncertainty, of week-by-week calculations about whether the company could meet its obligations, of management trying to restructure and renegotiate while the ground kept shifting beneath them. 2 years during which every worker who walked through those gates must have wondered, each morning, whether today was the day the fight ended. And then it did. The immediate aftermath was bureaucratic, receivers assessing assets, creditors forming queues, lawyers examining contracts. But for the people on the factory floor, the ones still there, the ones who'd survived the rationalization, the ones on short-term contracts who'd taken the job knowing it might vanish, the bureaucracy was beside the point. The point was that the thing they'd relied on was over. The wages would stop. The buses would stop. The rhythm that had organised their days and their families' days would stop. One line from that summer's local reporting haunts this story more than any other. The paper noted that Matchbox sales were apparently doing very well. And then, in the next breath, now the fate of the remaining workers is in the balance. Read those two facts together. Sales doing very well. Workers' fate in the balance. That's the whole tragedy of Lesney, compressed into 2 sentences. A company can sell millions of units and still die if the cost of making each one exceeds the revenue it brings in. If the debt accumulated during the years of struggle has grown too large to service, if the currency has moved so far that every export sale loses money. The product wasn't the problem. The product was never the problem. The problem was everything around the product. The economics, the financing, the exchange rates, the interest rate environment that made it impossible to borrow your way through the storm and impossible to survive without borrowing. Lesney products went into receivership. The exact date is a matter of minor historical ambiguity. Institutional accounts tend to place it in July 1982, while contemporary local reporting from that same July says receivers were called last month, pointing toward June. It doesn't matter, really. What matters is that it was summer, that the weather was warm, that the factory, which had once needed 3,600 pairs of hands to run at capacity, was winding down to silence. And the silence, when it came, was not like the silence at the end of a shift. The end of a shift was temporary. The machines would start again in a few hours or in the morning. This silence was different. This was the silence of a thing that had stopped and would not start again. The dies cooling in their presses, the paint lines draining, the conveyor belts motionless. The packing machines that had sealed 120 boxes a minute, still. For Hackney, the loss was not abstract. It was local, specific, measured in the faces of people who lived in the streets around the factory, people who had walked to work, or ridden the blue and yellow buses, or packed their children off to school, knowing that the wages from Lee Conservancy Road would cover the rent and the shopping and the small ordinary expenses that make a life. Those people, now, were looking at an uncertain future in a borough, in a city, in a country where unemployment was already climbing and manufacturing jobs were disappearing faster than anyone could count. What happens to a name when the company behind it dies? The Matchbox brand did not vanish with Lesney. It was far too valuable for that. Brands outlive their makers. That's the cold logic of intellectual property. The tooling, the designs, the name, the global recognition, these were assets, and assets get sold. The Matchbox brand and tooling were acquired out of receivership by Universal Holdings, which reorganised the business as Matchbox International Limited. The name survived. The designs survived. What didn't survive was the connection to the place that had made them. Production moved to Macau, to the factories of East Asia, where labour was cheaper, overheads lower, and the economics of die-cast toy manufacturing made the kind of sense they no longer made in East London. The workers of Hackney Wick, the women whose hands had fitted those tiny windows, the tool makers who'd cut moulds from chrome vanadium steel, the men who'd run the die-casting presses and loaded the lorries. Their skills didn't transfer to Macau. Their skills stayed in Hackney, where there was no longer a factory that needed them. The Matchbox name then followed the trajectory that global brands often follow when they become detached from their origins. It became a commodity, traded between corporations. In 1992, Tyco Toys agreed to acquire Matchbox International for a reported $135 million. And then, in 1997, Mattel's merger with Tyco was cleared by the Federal Trade Commission, bringing Matchbox under the same corporate umbrella as Hot Wheels, the very competitor whose arrival in 1968 had begun the slow unravelling of Lesney's certainties. There's an irony there so heavy it barely needs stating. The brand that had dominated the world from a factory beside the River Lee, the brand that had been forced to reinvent itself in response to Hot Wheels' challenge, the brand whose identity crisis had been part of the long chain of pressures that led to receivership. That brand was now owned by the company that made Hot Wheels. Matchbox and its old rival, together at last. Not as competitors, but as products in the same portfolio. The fight was over. It had been over for years, but the factory remained. Empty, silent, purposeless, but still standing. For nearly 3 decades after Lesney's collapse, the building on Lee Conservancy Road persisted as a physical fact. A mid-century industrial structure beside the canal, slowly decaying while the neighbourhood around it began to change. In ways that nobody in 1982 could have predicted. The change, when it came, wore the language of regeneration. London won the bid for the 2012 Olympic Games and the Lower Lea Valley, that landscape of canals and railways and old factories where Lesney had once been the dominant employer, became ground zero for one of the largest urban redevelopment projects in European history. The Olympic Park rose on the doorstep of the old Matchbox factory. The planning documents were precise. A 0.6 hectare site north of Homerton Road, running parallel to the River Lee navigation, close to the northern boundary of the 2012 Olympic Park. Previously used for the manufacture of Matchbox toy cars. Previously used. Past tense. The bureaucratic language of erasure. In early 2010, the factory was demolished. A local Hackney Wick blog recorded the moment with a grief that official documents couldn't accommodate. The historic Matchbox factory, completely demolished this week. A sad time. An end of an era. Residents came to watch. Some brought flasks of tea, the way people do when they're standing vigil at something they can't prevent. An iconic building disappearing into rubble and dust. What rose in its place was called Matchmaker's Wharf, a residential-led mixed-use development completed in 2012 on the fringe of the Olympic Park. Flats, studios, the kind of housing that London's property market demanded and that the planning framework encouraged. The name was a nod to what had been there before, a nod and nothing more. No factory, no machines, no assembly lines, no buses, no die-casting presses cycling through their rhythm of heat and pressure and tiny, perfect parts. The timeline is almost too neat to be accidental, though of course it was. The factory demolished as the Olympic Park was being built, housing completed in the year the Games arrived. One version of East London erased to make way for another. Industry replaced by residents. Production replaced by consumption. A place that made things replaced by a place where people live. Whether that's progress or loss depends on where you stand and what you remember and what you think a neighbourhood is for. Stand by the River Lee now on a quiet morning before the joggers and the cyclists fill the towpath. The water moves the way it's always moved, slowly south toward the Thames. The new buildings catch the light. The canal boats drift. It's pleasant. It's calm. It's a version of East London that the women who rode the blue and yellow buses to Lesney's gates would barely recognise. They wouldn't find the factory. They wouldn't find the loading bays where the lorries waited. They wouldn't find the car park, the canteen, the gate where you clocked in and left the street behind and entered the noise and heat and rhythm of a place that made something the whole world wanted. All of that is gone. Not ruined. Gone. Not decaying. Erased. The ruins you might expect to find after a factory closes, the broken windows, the weeds in the concrete, the particular silence of a building made for noise. Those ruins had their years, and then they too were cleared away, replaced by something new and clean and utterly different. What remains is smaller than a building. It fits in your hand. There are millions of them still. In attics and shoeboxes, in collectors' cabinets and charity shop bins, in the glove compartments of real cars and the bottom drawers of real desks. Matchbox cars. Battered, paint-chipped, wheel-worn, surviving. Each one stamped with the words that once meant a factory in Hackney, a workforce of thousands, a manufacturing operation of extraordinary precision. Made in England. Pick one up, feel the weight of it, heavier than you'd expect, because it's solid metal, not plastic, not hollow. Run your thumb across the roof the way a child's thumb ran across it 40 years ago, pushing it along a carpet, racing it across a kitchen floor. The paint is worn where the grip was tightest. The wheels still turn, though they're stiff now. The doors might open, might not. Hinges clogged with decades of dust and whatever mysterious sediment accumulates in the pockets of children's coats. This is the ruin you can hold. Not a crumbling wall or a rusted girder or a weed-split car park. The usual furniture of British industrial memory. This is a ruin that fits in a palm. That still looks, despite everything, like the thing it was meant to be. A tiny Jaguar, a small Mercedes, a miniature Rolls Royce, silver as the day it left the paint line, nearly. Almost. And if you hold it, if you really hold it, and think about what it took to make it, you're holding the whole story. The molten metal poured in Hackney, the mould cut by a toolmaker whose name nobody recorded, the paint sprayed by someone who did it 1,000 times a day and got it right every time, the assembly done by hands that were quick and sure and belonged to a woman who rode a blue and yellow bus to work each morning and went home each evening to a terraced house within earshot of the factory. The packing machine that sealed the box, the lorry that carried it away, the shop counter where a child reached for it and a parent said yes because it only cost pennies, because it was just a small thing, because what harm could it do? 1 million of these, every day, for years. From one factory, beside one river, in one corner of East London. Gone now. The factory, the workforce, the buses, the machines. The way of making things that this place represented, high volume, tight margin, precision manufacturing, done by thousands of ordinary people in an ordinary part of London, producing an object so perfectly judged for its market that it conquered the world and still couldn't survive the world's indifference to how it was made or where it came from. The Matchbox name lives on. You can buy one today, in a supermarket, in a toy shop, online. It'll be made in a factory on the other side of the world by different hands, under a different corporate banner. It'll be a decent toy. It might even be a good one. But it won't be this. It won't carry the weight of this particular story. The story of what Hackney Wick built and what Hackney Wick lost, and what the distance between those two things tells you about the country that let it happen. The river doesn't care. The river moves on. It carried barges when the marshland was drained and the factories went up. It carried nothing when the factories came down. It carries narrowboats now, and kayakers, and the reflections of buildings that have no memory of what stood here before. But the cars remain. Small, heavy, stubborn. Paint worn, wheels stiff, made in England still legible if you tilt them toward the light. 1,000,000 ruins you can hold. 1,000,000 tiny witnesses to something that was real and brilliant and is not coming back.